Machiavelli wrote the line that gets misquoted more than almost anything else in political philosophy, that it's safer to be feared than loved, and everyone who's ever repeated it half remembers it wrong. Because the real insight was never about fear at all. You felt the actual mechanism underneath. The friend who took advantage of your kindness, the moment being liked mattered more to you than being respected. The colleague who walked over a boundary you never enforced because they'd learned your affection didn't require anything from them in return. The relationship where you gave and gave, certain that love alone would hold it together, and watched it collapse the moment love stopped being backed by anything else. By the end of this, you'll understand what Machiavelli actually meant, why it has almost nothing to do with cruelty, and why chasing love instead of respect is one of the most reliable ways to lose both. The misreading of this idea has done real damage, because most people hear fear over love and picture something ugly, intimidation, coldness, a life built on being disliked. That's not the argument. Machiavelli's actual claim was narrower and far more useful. Love is unreliable because it depends entirely on the other person's continued goodwill, and goodwill evaporates the instant it becomes fear, or more precisely, respect backed by consequence, doesn't have that vulnerability because it doesn't depend on anyone's mood. The first principle is that love without structure is a debt someone else decides whether to repay. Think about what happens when a relationship, a friendship, a working dynamic runs entirely on affection with nothing behind it. It functions perfectly as long as it's convenient for everyone involved. The moment it stops being convenient, the moment loyalty costs something, the moment supporting you requires the other person to take a real risk, affection alone rarely survives that test. Machiavelli observed this in princes who were adored right up until the crown needed defending, and the adoring subjects discovered their love had never been asked to cost them anything. It's not that people are fickle by nature. It's that affection was never built to withstand a real cost, because nothing was ever established that made abandoning you expensive. The second principle is that respect, unlike love, doesn't require the other person to feel a certain way about you in order to function. This is the part that gets missed constantly. Respect isn't about being feared in the dramatic sense. It's about being someone whose boundaries carry real consequences, so that honoring them doesn't depend on whether the other person happens to like you that day. Well, Chris, I had to do it. A person who respects you might not even particularly enjoy you. That's fine. Respect operates independently of enjoyment, which is exactly why it's more durable. You don't need someone's affection to hold a line. You need them to understand that crossing it costs something, and that understanding survives bad moods, disagreements, and inconvenient timing in a way that affection never does. Here's what's worth sitting with, because it's where people get this wrong in their own lives constantly. The instinct to be loved is not a character flaw, but it becomes a liability the moment it replaces the instinct to be respected. You can want both. Most people do. The mistake is prioritizing the one that feels warmer in the short term, while ignoring the one that actually protects you in the long term. Every time you've let something slide, because confronting it might make someone like you less, you are trading a small amount of respect for a small amount of warmth. And that trade compounds. Enough of those trades, and you've built a relationship, a reputation, or a position that runs entirely on people's temporary goodwill, which means it can be withdrawn the moment goodwill runs out, and it always eventually does. The third principle is that being feared or respected doesn't require cruelty, and this is where Machiavelli's critics usually stop reading too early. His actual advice to the prince wasn't to be hated. He was explicit that hatred is as dangerous as excessive love, maybe more so, because hatred invites active opposition, where indifference invites none. The goal was never fear in the sense of terror. It was consequent. It was making sure that mistreating you, betraying you, or crossing you had a real cost attached, so that people who might otherwise take advantage calculated the cost and decided against it, not because they loved you too much to risk it, but because the math didn't work in their favor. This is the distinction that changes how you actually apply this in your own life. You don't need to become harder to love. You need to become someone whose boundaries have teeth, independent of how warmly you're currently being perceived. That means the consequence for crossing you can't only exist in your head. It has to be something people have actually seen enacted, or at minimum, believe would be enacted. A boundary nobody has ever seen you enforce isn't a boundary. It's a preference, and preferences get ignored the moment they're inconvenient for someone else to respect. The final realization is this: every time you chose being liked over being respected, you were optimizing for a feeling that expires the moment it becomes costly to maintain. Machiavelli's insight was never really about fear versus love as opposing forces. It was about durability versus fragility, about which foundation survives contact with real pressure, and which one only survives as long as nothing is ever asked of it. Respect asks something of people before it's tested. Love asks nothing until the moment it's tested, and by then, it's often too late to discover it wasn't strong enough to hold. If this changed how you think about being liked versus being respected, that's exactly the point. If you want to see what happens when someone tests a boundary that has no consequence behind it, Wilson,